what it details is kind of just the evolution of work. And I think helpful to know the way we work today and how it's changing. So if you think back to how most of us work today, this thing called a job, it's been with us for about 140 years and lots of good reasons why we created this thing called a job. Disparate cottage industries, disparate activities aggregated into a job, the job becoming the basis for that relationship between a person and a position, that job being aggregated into job families, functions, becoming the basis for this thing called a career. And if you think back, let's use our friends at Ford as an example. When Henry Ford adapted the assembly line, all of those capabilities built under one roof at really high fixed cost. The cost of producing an incremental car when you've hit the capacity of the plant meant you had to stand up a whole new plant, supply chain, etc. You fast forward to the third industrial revolution, and this carefully constructed value chain starts getting chipped away at because we started to democratize information. And for the first time, we could look outside the walls of a company and understand the cost, capabilities, and risks of work being done elsewhere by someone else or by us in a different part of the world. Interestingly, Nike was one of the first companies, very apropos, given the gate many of us walked through at the Acropolis. But Nike was one of the first companies to figure out that they could distribute, they could separate design and marketing from supply and manufacturing and distribute that to the lowest cost, lowest risk, highest capability options. It's what we know to be the start of outsourcing. And the average gains there, about 30% in terms of efficiency, as we went from building capabilities to increasingly renting them. Fast forward to arguably where we sit today in the fourth industrial revolution, and what you see is the overlay of the democratization of work onto the democratization of information. And what you see is the rise of the platform organization, work increasingly being deconstructed and distributed and being reconstructed. Instead of capabilities being built in that second industrial revolution to being rented, now capabilities increasingly being shared. Think of Uber. What's the cost of Uber adding an incremental car or incremental driver or an incremental passenger? Virtually zero, right? So the marginal cost of that incremental revenue is down to virtually zero because of the platform construct, in stark contrast to what Henry Ford might have experienced. And I think as we look forward, and this is really the thesis of the book that my co-author John Boudreau and I have written with its many case studies, is what we start to see is the job starting to give way to work and skills becoming the currency of work. An increasingly more agile enterprise emerging as we transcend that one-to-one relationship and the frictional cost of work being done in jobs to increasingly skills and capabilities becoming the currency of the organization. Now, to be fair, jobs aren't going away anytime soon, and we'll talk about the reasons why there will always, at least for the foreseeable future, be a reason for work to be organized in jobs. But we're increasingly seeing jobs give way to more agile ways of working. And that's what I'd love to spend the next bit talking to you about as we think about navigating the growing volatility that Amelia talked about, the growing uncertainty, as well as what Tom talked about in terms of the role of technology. So first up, a poll question for all of you. When you think of work in your organization, and if you think of the four models that I talked about, if you will, what dominates work in your organizations? What's the primary organizing construct? Interesting. This is a far more evolved group than my average audience. The fact that the second industrial revolution is only 6%, and we've got 11% in a post-fourth industrial revolution world. Something I'd love to explore as we get into our breakouts and hear some examples from you of some of the things you're doing. So against that context, against that brief history lesson, what I wanted to do was sort of pivot to how the pandemic has accelerated things, and Tom talked about some of this. You know, in June of 2020, Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, said that we've seen a 2-year trend in digitalization get pulled forward in the last 2 months, the first 2 months of the pandemic. I actually think the implications for the future of work are far more profound. Think of all the things that Tom talked about. You know, if we just picked on those 2 dimensions of the where and when of work, in 1970, Alvin Toffler wrote about us living in electronic cottages. And 50 years later, a whopping 6% of all work in the United States was being done full-time remote. And overnight, in March of 2020, that number jumped to 56%. Quite sure we aren't going back to 6%. We may not stay at 56, given some of Benedict Frey's research and the like, but the future is certainly going to be very, very different. And that's just one dimension of the future, 2 dimensions of the future of work. So when we think about it, it's certainly the where and when, but it's what is the work, how's the work being done, who's doing it, including the machines, and increasingly, as we've all experienced with our workforces, the why of work. You know, why should I contribute to your mission and purpose? A tough question to answer when you've got those devices surveilling people. But as we look at this reset, I think what we're seeing is a pivot from our traditional focus on growth, efficiency, and return, that steady 15% earnings growth every year at all cost, to, I think, a much more encompassing view of performance and a focus on resilience, flexibility, and agility. I think the threats that Amelia talked about, the growing challenges that Tom talked about, really drive home this point about resilience. And do we have business models that are more resilient in the face of growing uncertainty, growing volatility? And when we step back and think about what characterizes resilience, flexibility, and agility, 5 things kind of jump out at me. The first is a portfolio-based approach to work, having leaders who understand the trade-offs between employees and jobs versus agile talent pools versus onshoring and outsourcing versus the use of automation. So the capacity to be able to orchestrate and know when to pivot from one option to another. Secondly, the agility of flowing talent to work and transcending the frictional cost of jobs. We've seen some great experiments over the course of the pandemic of organizations that have done that. For example, Bank of America, at the height of the pandemic, moved 1,300 people from its head office to deal with the influx of calls in their contact centers. And if you talk to Sherry Bronstein, their CHRO, they, for the first time, understood the skills and capabilities that weren't showing up in their system of record. Who could actually deal with the emotion of a customer calling up and trying to get their benefits from the CARES Act in the United States. So thinking of connecting talent to work through more agile means. Speaking of which, who here is looking at or has introduced a talent marketplace? Can I just see a show of hands? Okay, decent number. For those of you who haven't, the talent marketplaces are probably the hottest area in HR tech. There's more venture capital and private equity money flowing into companies like Gloat, Eightfold, Hitch, Fuel 50, et cetera, in large part because of how they are helping us address some of the opportunities that have come about from the future of work. And I'll come back to that in a second to give you some specific examples. The third dimension to this is from a leadership perspective. How do we increase the quality of decision-making from the edges of the enterprise? The edges of the enterprise where threats like the pandemic are first spotted and perhaps most acutely felt. The edges of the enterprise where innovation often has the highest premium. And so leadership capacity being distributed increasingly. Fourthly, much greater collaboration between companies. That's one of the benefits, if I could even call something from COVID a benefit, that we thought beyond ourselves. You know, if you look at McDonald's in Germany sharing its talent with Aldi, the retailer, at the height of the pandemic, when McDonald's restaurants were closed and demand for Aldi's retail services had increased. We helped a number of airlines in the United States transition their baggage handlers into the distribution centers of different retailers where demand was spiking because of the close matching of the skills required to perform both jobs. Not many people were flying, lots of people were buying things from Walmart and Target, et cetera. And the last piece, something that Tom touched on, the implications of this pivot to Web 3.0 and the metaverse. I know it's all the rage to buy virtual land, and it's really expensive these days, unlike falling real property prices. But the thing that really gets me quite intrigued are two things. One is, as we look at technologies like 5G expanding, particularly in factories and warehouses, we're now seeing the reduced latency allow us to think about virtual and distributed work in ways that we haven't had to do before. We've distributed work and done virtual work for white-collar work over the pandemic, but we've got an organization we work with that is actually operating their lift trucks in France from a shared services center in the Philippines. That would never have been possible, sort of 3 or 4 years ago, but the reduced latency now has allowed them to do that. So some of the advances from Web 3.0. But I do think, and I really was struck, Amelia, by some of your, I left your remarks quite terrified, actually, about what's to come next, to be honest. But it did bring home the point that we've seen from all of our research, which is every time we have a shock to the global economy, our talent looks for certainty and stability. It's the most human and most basic of instincts. But for private enterprises, like most of us in this room, I think the best we can do is the promise of clarity for a changing world and the promise of continued relevance for that world. I was in a focus group last week with a bunch of millennials for an organization, and someone said it really well. My dad had his pension. My pension are the upskilling and reskilling programs that you're providing me, which I thought was incredibly insightful, and it really speaks to something we've all seen around the growing primacy of development at the heart of the New Deal. Just a little bit of research. I appreciate this might be a bit of an eye chart from the back, but I wanted to call out a couple of things from Mercer's Global Talent Trends study, which was just done this year, and we talked to a number of executives around the world and got their insight into what was on their minds and what do they expect to do as the specter of a recession grows every day. A couple of things I think worth calling out. One is, I think, a sense that this employee-centric labor market that we're in many countries around the world will probably not go away, even if we run into a recession. That shortage of the skills needed to power the business model will probably remain. Something someone else said, I forget who it was during Tom's remarks, that point about digital exhaustion. That has continued to go up. And over the years we've done this survey, that has accelerated exponentially. And it's leading to some of the things you see to the right of that, some of the absenteeism and the loss of talent. Perhaps most interesting, and this I think will be something that we explore, as executives look at the specter of a recession, it's fascinating to see where they are going to be reducing expense versus investing more. And unsurprisingly, the continued investments in AI and automation, which we saw through the pandemic, will continue to accelerate. Reskilling will continue to accelerate. And I don't know about you, but it's the conversations that I've been having of late are quite heartening in the sense that there is a growing realization that there is a much higher return on reskilling and upskilling than there ever was. And that, quote unquote, the disposable model that we had, where we did a reduction in force every time we had a transformation and then went out and hired new people with the right skill, is not the sustainable model, in large part because of some of the labor shortages that we're seeing. So against the backdrop of that data, I sort of sat back with some of the folks I work with at the World Economic Forum, and we said, what's going to characterize the outcome of this reset? And there were two things that kind of jumped out at us. One is, and I think this has got massive implication for the work that all of you do, how do we redesign work to enable talent to flow to it as seamlessly as possible as our business models change, as new threats emerge, while ensuring that that talent has the visibility and the resources to keep perpetually reinventing itself? That notion of upskilling and reskilling and even outskilling. And then secondly, how do we re-envision the talent experience to meet more and more talent on their individual terms versus forcing them to fit a one-size-fits-most model. And I do think if we are to address some of the emerging challenges, I'll just pick in the United States. The issues with the labor shortage are somewhat intractable because until we have immigration reform, that problem is not going away because that country plugged its gaps for years with immigration. And that spigot got turned off when he who shall not be named was named president. And you see that in the statistics where net immigration went from 1.2 million down to, I think, 200,000 or 300,000, which is a pretty dramatic fall. So two questions that we'll come back to as we go through the balance of the hour. Now, at the heart of much of this shift is something that's been talked about now for a couple of years, that legacy model that came from the second industrial revolution of that one-to-one relationship between a degree, a person, and a position. On the left, what gave us the construct of a job, that notion of linear career paths, either vertical or horizontal, and technology being an enabler, increasingly giving away to the many between skills, work, and numerous nano and micro upskilling and reskilling opportunities on demand. And it's where we see this plurality of means for getting work done. Might be a job, might be a work, might be a task, it might be a project. And increasingly, I think algorithms that I think Paul said it really well in our breakout yesterday, not just linear careers, but squiggly careers. Because each of us, as a result of an algorithm, might get pointed out to 12 to 13 different opportunities over a period of time based on the adjacencies of our skills. And it's one of the areas where these marketplaces that I talked about, these talent insight platforms, are proving to be absolutely pivotal to the work of HR, because we start to see these algorithms becoming increasingly a partner for the HR function, for the organization, in more efficiently and effectively and impactfully connecting skills to work. Now, that was really at the heart of this book that John Boudreau and I wrote, our fourth together. And if anyone's interested, we've actually got some extra copies at the Mercer stand. Hopefully there'll still be a demand after this session. But the reason we wrote the book was as we looked at organizations experimenting with agile, new ways of working, the thing that seemed to consistently get in the way of some of those new techniques of management was the fact that we were still using a second industrial revolution construct to try to drive some very different outcomes. And as we looked at that, we said, what's going to characterize this new work operating system? And there were four things that kind of jumped out at us, four principles, if you will. The first is starting with the work. What's the current and future work of the organization, not how we organize it today into a job. A couple of years ago, I went back and looked at all of the job descriptions that Mercer gathers and looked at it over the course of the last 40 years. And this will be no surprise to anyone here, but the average job description for a job that existed 40 years ago has gone from being about this big to being at this big. Because as technology has changed, as work has changed, all we've done is keep uploading new tasks, new activities, et cetera. And so we've kind of got the dog's breakfast of different requirements, if you will. And it makes it really hard to fill a job, right? Because you need Superman or Superwoman to actually come in. So starting with the work, then asking the question of what's the optimal combinations of humans and automation. Our third book together, Reinventing Jobs, we looked at 130 different case studies and illustrated a framework to help business leaders achieve that optimal combination by leading with the work and understanding where could a particular type of automation substitute versus augment versus actually create new human work. Once you've done that, asking the question of what's the best way to connect talent to work? Should it be a job? Should it be an employee in an agile pool that's connecting to work through a marketplace? Or perhaps a gig worker? One of the things we saw in that global talent trend study was a significant spike in chief executives looking at gig workers to resource work, and perhaps not an unpredictable response given the volatility of the economy and the growing uncertainty. And then the last dimension to that, allowing talent to flow to work ever more seamlessly. versus being limited to some fixed traditional jobs. And I'll share an example of what Unilever has done and some of the really interesting outcomes that they've realized from that. Against that framework, what we did was define 3 models for how organizations are connecting talent to work. The first is on the left, where we've been for 140 years, right? Employees in fixed roles. And that's going to certainly continue because there are lots of good reasons for different bodies of work. It could be that the work is highly location specific. It could be that you're in an industry that's regulated, there's compliance and control reasons, and the job remains the primary construct for that work. And the enabling infrastructure, the things we're all familiar with, job architecture, workforce planning that is largely position-based, and certainly a lot of activity currently to update job architectures with the new skills being required of talent in those roles. But increasingly, as we think of moving one click to the right, and think of the 3 models, not to be too cute about it, as fixed, flex, and flow. That flex model, this is where we're seeing more and more organizations introduce talent marketplaces as a way of driving greater agility, greater productivity even, where an employee might be in a job, but she has the flexibility to either express her skills in a different domain to someone with data skills in IT taking on a project in HR, or to go acquire some new skills elsewhere. And the marketplace can be incredibly powerful at signaling the changing demand for skills, as we're seeing in a number of organizations. And this is where it starts to get interesting because you're starting to see the job give way to skills being the currency of work, and you have the 2 sort of coexisting. It's where you see the marketplace starting to take on much greater prominence, and workforce planning becomes more and more about skills-based planning. And then the far right is what I like to think of as agile on steroids. And it's essentially where you have a fully flow to work model. It might be all employees, but they're all connecting to work through a talent marketplace. And this, where organizations have been experimenting with this, is where we need certain skills across the enterprise. Think data scientists, we need them in IT, we need them in finance, we need them in HR. Digital talent, we need them for the external interface as well as the employee interface. Program managers, project managers. I'll share an example with you of what one organization did to actually blow up those particular roles and the productivity gains that they realized. And the impact has really been quite profound. For those, I'd love some examples when we get into the discussion part of this, but some of the results and outcomes that we've seen as companies have moved from left to right, much reduced time to fill as the talent pool is now sort of significantly expanded, greater visibility into the skills we have and how those skills might be changing, more insight into emerging and declining work. And this is a really important point because when you've got all of the work going through an algorithm, the algorithm is able to send leaders signals as to what work is being demanded, what are the gaps of the skills in the organization, versus when work is limited to a job. And we're limited to largely a manager delegating work to someone based on the demand he or she might be seeing. And then significantly increased agility and productivity. And I'll share some stats in a second. I think we have a question next. Yeah. So as you think about the 3 models, which one best characterizes work in your organization? And you can pick more than one. The flex thing keeps going up. Again, you've exceeded expectations. Well done. It's really intriguing to see the percentage of work that is in the flex bucket because I don't see that very often. So I want to do a couple of things now. I'd like to share 2 examples of what flex and flow might look like. One of the examples is Unilever. I've had the privilege of working with them since 2017, and it was fascinating to see them embark on this journey towards flexibility. And it started off with Alan Jope and Lena Nair, then their CHRO, saying, every day our business model is changing. We've got new technology coming into play, we've got new competitors, we're making portfolio decisions. Why is it that those conversations don't cascade down to our people? And our people think their jobs are static and fixed. And we're a, 125, 130-year-old organization. We're going to change as more in the next 5 years than we might have in the last 15. So how do we get that narrative down? And with a really bold ambition of saying, we want to create a model where people engage with us ever more flexibly, and we take on the risk of ensuring that they're productive. We take on the risk of ensuring that they're contributing to us. And so that started with their framework for the future of work. This was the basis for a report that the World Economic Forum wrote, which started with their performance management process, which I've yet to meet an organization that's actually happy with their performance management process in my 30+ years of doing this. But they made a pretty significant change to change it from a traditional goals and objectives discussion to being about a future fit conversation. So 4 simple questions that everyone has to answer, which are geared to asking the question of how will you ensure the continued well-being of your family, yourself and your spouse and children, as well as your professional relevance. And that led to a future fit plan where everyone would have to go through a conversation of how are you going to upskill for the role you're in? Because it's going to change in some way, shape, or form. Let's talk about what the quantum of change is, what's driving that change, and if this is of interest to you. If you aren't interested in upskilling, how might you be reskilled for a different role? What are the skill adjacencies? Alternatively, if you aren't interested in that, how might you be outskilled? How do we equip you to continue to be successful, away from Unilever? Here's access to a stipend, here's access to learning resources, and potentially the opportunity of being placed elsewhere. And that's then led to their UFlex model, which has been quite fascinating to see in practice. I think some of you may know that they first started doing it with folks approaching retirement in the UK, and actually figured out that as they moved to this model of flexibility, they could economically justify paying people a stipend to be a part of the Unilever community, and then a project-based reward as they took on different projects based on their flexibility, based on their ability to contribute to it, etc. But perhaps one of the most interesting things is what they've done over the course of the pandemic with their internal marketplace. And I want to play a quick video for you. You can see some of the statistics of the return that they got, but they say it better than I can. So if that is a model of flex, before we go to our breakouts, I want to share a case study with you of what that flow to work model might look like. And this is it's a case study in the book. It's of a large insurance company, European insurance company, that was really struggling with their data scientists. What they found that they had these pockets of wealth and pockets of poverty. So lots of really qualified people in customer analytics. HR couldn't hire data scientists, often IT couldn't hire them. And the CEO said, we're done with this traditional insurance industry model of each country having its own talent pool, each line having its own talent pool. And they created this virtual, for want of a better phrase, shared services pool of talent. And they did a number of really interesting things, and the payoff was massive. So they pulled all of this talent out of the functions and geographies, put them into a virtual cloud-based construct, and they put everyone into one job code in Workday. Because the rationale was that we wanted a single job code, so we had a baseline for pay and rewards, but we're going to flex pay based on the skills you have and the change in your skills profile. So let me give you a specific example here. So let's say I'm the person running Singapore as the business, and I need to stand up a new direct-to-consumer channel. So I sit down with, oh, by the way, remember my point about work design being a core capability? Well, their HR function stood up a new center of expertise to teach managers how to design good projects and good work, to move them beyond that traditional muscle of I need work done, and so I'm either going to delegate the work or go to my HR business partner and have him or her open a new requisition. Don't get to do that anymore. That ability was taken away, but now I need to work with this head of the center of expertise to design a project. And so I sit down with that person and we say, new direct-to-consumer channel, I need a user interface. That's going to require UI, UX design skills. For this period of time, I need a referral engine so that customers are getting recommendations on different products based on insights about our relationship with them. That's going to need Python skills, etc. All of that gets designed, and since they had so many data scientists sitting around who weren't particularly productive, they built the marketplace themselves. And so they drop all of this in, and the algorithm is looking for 4 things. It's looking for, across this pool of data scientists, and after the data scientists, they added all their digital talent, who's got the skills to do the work? If we haven't got someone with the direct skills, who's got adjacent skills, where this could be an experience for them to gain new skills, but they've got the core technical requirements to do the work? Who's got the capacity? Probably a little frightening, given what Tom was talking about, but it actually scans their Outlook calendar to see, do you have the capacity to take on work? And can you be on this project for 6 months of the year at 50% time? The 4th screen is really interesting. If you think of diversity, equity, and inclusion, we address it in extremely episodic ways. We do it when we hire someone. We do it when we promote them, when we change their pay. And it happens incredibly episodically because it's based on this notion of a person in a position and all of the milestones associated with that. And I think, as all of you know, we're often paying for the sins of the previous employer or the previous manager. And so what they did to counter this was to say, we're going to have the algorithm actively screen for the diversity of the talent pool. So let's say, hypothetically, my pool of 5-star Python developers are all Asian men. So I'm not going to get anywhere by continuing to give this pool of talent this opportunity. But I've got an African-American female who is a 4-star developer, and the only reason she isn't in this pool is because she hasn't done a direct-to-consumer channel. So by giving her access to the opportunity, I, in one fell swoop, increase the diversity of the pool, and because we've got a skills-based pay model, her compensation will automatically adjust to that level at the next pay cycle. And think about it. They had hundreds, if not thousands, of projects going on every single year. And so thousands of opportunities to keep screening and looking at DEI issues and automatically adjusting for them. 3 lessons learned from this that were really interesting. One was, I mentioned earlier about signals about demand. When you've got the volume, velocity, and variability of work on being driven through an algorithm, what you get are direct signals between what skills are being demanded, what's the supply of skills in my organization, and what are the gaps that need to be closed. So if I'm that 5-star Python developer, I get a signal that says demand for Python is trending down, and what we're seeing is demand for Julia trending up, which is something we've seen in Silicon Valley for the last number of years. Ravin, you are 2 learning resources away from being certified in Julia, and here's access to those resources to close those gaps. And so a direct connection between demand, supply, and investments to close those skill gaps. The second thing that they learned, I talked about the skills-based pay architecture. So their base pay was tied to skills that adjusted annually based on skill premiums, and their incentives were project-based incentives. Every project had an incentive pool, and the team would share in that incentive pool. So the UI UX person, the data scientist, the infrastructure person, the DevOps person, they would all share in the pool. And the idea being that you individually benefit when you acquire skills, but we collectively win when you express those skills in a way that benefits the company. Who here did competency-based pay in the 90s? And I'm really dating myself. Oh, come on, there's more of us in here. So I got competency-based pay, for those of you younger than me, was all the rage in the 90s, as some of you may remember. I used to get these emails from CEOs saying, well done, you've single-handedly elevated our wage base without a commensurate improvement in productivity. We're going back to market-based pay. And so we have a similar risk with skills-based pay, right? Because you don't want to be paying for skills that you can't commercialize. And that's what this organization actually did, because since all the work is flowing through the algorithm, the actual changes in the skills were a function of, can we commercialize these skills? It's great that we've got the Mercer skills pricer data, shameless bit of promotion there. But the adjustment we're going to make is a function of our ability to commercialize those skills. Because if we can't commercialize Julia at the rate that Google can, we can't be paying at those premiums because it's detrimental to our business model. So that was the second big learning. And the third was from a leadership and a managerial perspective, because now that the algorithm has all of this data, the team is receiving nudges from the algorithm. We're running too slow on the user interface. Paul, you're running too far ahead of everyone else on the algorithm. You know, we're running behind budget. And so me as the business leader for Singapore get to do what HR has been yelling at me to do for years. Coach, develop, and mentor that team while they're under my stewardship for the 6 months of the project. So I thought a fascinating example, and before we go to our breakouts, the thing that was absolutely mind-blowing was that when they went back and tracked the productivity gains, because they had reduced the attrition, they'd increased the agility with which people connected to projects, the gain was actually 600%, which is a massive improvement in productivity, something we're going to be talking about in one of our panels. But the thing that they also realized was we have to make work sustainable. And so the next phase that they've embarked on is, how do we design space for learning and well-being into the flow of work? So we aren't burning our people out by consistently sort of sending them from one project to another. Sort of the counter of some of the issues that Tom was talking about around surveillance. And actually being bold enough to say, we know when enough is enough. And we're not going to keep saying 15% earnings gains every year to power our stock. As you think about this transition, and I think you might have alluded to it a second ago, it's a massive change for your leaders and managers, right? And there were 5 things that kind of jumped out at John and I as we were doing this research. You know, the first is, and I don't in any way trivialize these changes. You know, from hierarchical authority, we've got 140 years of learned behavior to increasingly empowered and aligned leadership, where this notion of leadership brand becomes increasingly important in that more agile construct. From technical automation, just because something is possible, should we be automating it? You know, to more humanistic work automation. You'll see an example in the book of an organization, a very large global retailer, that led with automation and ended up breaking a lot of stuff. Because what you miss is the connectivity between that technology and the rest of that ecosystem or the environment, and the very critical role that your talent plays there, and all the knowledge and expertise that they have in enabling the system to work. I've talked about the episodic focus on DEI to a continual focus on DEI, where it becomes a part of the system, not a manual intervention that HR has to exercise, you know, constantly to keep the organization honest. From digital savvy, which we've talked about our leaders having, I think to a much higher bar of technological fluency. Understanding the changing types of automation. Where does RPA make sense? What breed of RPA? Where does machine learning actually make a difference? I think the bar is going to keep getting raised because those options are going to keep changing. And probably the most significant one, I think, from a traditional model of talent connecting to work to increasingly work connecting to talent, from process execution to more and more being project guidance, aided by increasingly AI as a work partner. The last thing I wanted to leave you with are just these 4 big changes. I started talking about Alvin Toffler. You can clearly tell he's one of my favorite futurists, and I want to end with him because I thought he said it incredibly well in Future Shock when he said the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who can't read and write. It'll be those who can't learn, unlearn, and relearn. And I think that is just such an appropriate quote for the world we live in. Thank you all very much.